So, if you're an activist, you seem to have come to the right place. There's a TV channel of our very own on this YouTube. And 24 hours a day, if you tune in, wherever you are in the world, you're able to watch activists talking about how to save the world and the various ways that we have to do it. So, this happens live during my noon hour, 12:30 to 1 o'clock Eastern Time in Toronto. And then we make recordings of these, and every now and then I take about three of them and put them together to make a composite or a recap. And this is one of those recaps. This is the third recap that I've made so far. And this is a humdinger. We have Craig Smith in California, who is an expert on global warming and has co-authored a book called Reaching Net Zero. And we have Paul Copeland here in Toronto. He's a retired human rights lawyer, and he will be talking with me about the Rohingya in Myanmar and Bangladesh. And we also then have Gordon Edwards and Susan O'Donnell, who are very concerned about the proposal to develop small modular nuclear reactors. And they're trying to block it, and I don't blame them. So let's get busy and hear composite number 3. So agriculture and global warming are highly connected, very, very important. So we want to explore that and see whether promoting various improved methods of agriculture can help us get to net zero. So good morning, Craig Smith.
Good morning, Metta. I thought we might start off by explaining that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, refers to emissions from agriculture and land use and forestry and farming and so on. It lumps all that together under one category, and which they give an abbreviation AFOLU, standing for land use, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I should also mention that you wrote a very nice article. It's in Peace Magazine in March 2020, with the intriguing title, Can Trees and Cows Save Us? So I read that with great interest. You had a number of interesting points, so I will not try to go back over the things that you said. We need to reach net zero, and that's the point where human emissions of greenhouse gases are such that they can be captured or absorbed on Earth and no more goes into the atmosphere. That's a hypothetical point. It's very difficult to reach as we sit today. There are optimistic persons that say we can do that by 2050. Frankly, I don't think that's possible for various reasons.
You don't think?
But anyway,
sorry, that's what John Kerry is and Biden are trying to aim for now, to net zero by 2050.
Yes,
right?
And I think their perspective is only for the U.S.
Oh.
And I don't think even the U.S. is going to be able to do that, frankly, although I wish it could. But the fact that the U.S. is only a small part of the total global emissions, we're second to China, and it's two countries account for a good portion of global emissions, but for the world as a total, we're going to have extreme difficulty in trying to get there by 2050.
Well, China has.
Anyway, I'd like to.
I believe Xi has said his goal is by net zero by 2060. I believe.
Yes, he did do that. He said that not long ago. And again, that is an enormous challenge for China. Uh, Again, I don't know how believable that is because China is building dozens of coal-fired power plants, and I can't picture that they're going to stop building those plants or shut them down. So they have a big obstacle right there.
Well, yes, but they're also leading the way globally in terms of making solar panels, and I don't know about wind, but solar anyway. I've heard that that's the place to go to get your solar panels.
Well, yes, China is to be commended for a number of things. Simply stating that goal is commendable. They are proceeding with I think they have installed more wind power than any other country. They're proceeding with solar power. They have a very aggressive program to develop electric vehicles of all sizes, from motor scooters to trucks and buses. I think at last count, there were 20 electric vehicles manufacturers in China. Amazing.
That is.
And they are looking at that as green energy as a new global market that they would like to dominate. Carbon dioxide accounts for about 3/4 of all greenhouse gases, with methane and oxygen or nitrous oxides making up most of the rest. So another way of looking at it is that fossil fuels make up about 75% of all greenhouse gases. And the balance, another 25%, comes directly or indirectly from agriculture, forestry, and land use. And another key point we have to remember is that about 30% of global emissions of carbon dioxide don't go into the atmosphere. About 30% is captured on Earth in plants and soil. Now, that's very important, and that's where agriculture and land use comes into play, because as we're seeing now, rapid deforestation and a large extent of uncontrolled wildfires, not only in the western United States, in my state, California, but also vast portions of tropical forests in Brazil and Indonesia. But with the loss of that ability to capture carbon, our problem becomes worse. And uncontrolled burning for agricultural purposes, to burn clearing land, burning the trees and brush that's taken down or removed, is another source of carbon dioxide. So in our book, which you mentioned earlier, Reaching Net Zero, we looked at 9 different actions that my co-author and I felt were technically and economically feasible to consider. And of those, we narrowed down to 5 that we felt were really practical and could have an effect over the next 3 decades. Unfortunately, we did not include agriculture and land use practices and in our estimate. And the reason for that was that we determined that agriculture emissions are increasing about 1% per year. It's pretty much on par with population growth. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that there are many things that could be done in terms of changing crops, different methods of fertilizing, using different processes for raising cattle, some of which you talked about in your paper. But part of the difficulty is the diffuse nature of agriculture. In large countries with well-developed and advanced agricultural systems, that more can be done. But when you look across the world, there's maybe 1 million small farmers all over the world. Very difficult that they're going to A, have the means or understanding of new technologies, and B, resources to implement changes that might be required.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us sort of a pessimistic outlook about how much can actually be done. While in principle things could be done, how much can be done and how fast could it be done? The other thing is that there's growing prosperity, not for everybody, but in general. And with rising incomes, then people's diets start changing, and the consumption of meat, for example, grows up. A lot of Brazil's work on getting rid of forests is to increase cattle raising.
Yeah.
So there's a huge demand for cattle, for beef products. So that's, again, operating in opposition to what we would like to see happen.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things that can be done, but the question is, how practical will it be to actually make progress?
Mm-hmm.
It should be a strong global effort. And here again, China has committed, and many countries have set targets for planting trees. I think for that to really take off, it will require some of the wealthy countries to provide funding to assist in the countries less able to do that, and provide an incentive for them to do that.
One of the people that I've talked to a couple of times is a man named Tom Newmark, who is the co-founder and head of something called the Carbon Underground. And their whole mission in the world is to promote better forms of agriculture for the sake of global warming. And he believes that corporations are actually a big asset, that because food corporations buy up large quantities of the produce globally, and because they are mindful of the fact that there's only allegedly something like 60 more crops in the world's soil before it's all completely depleted, and that we have to make some real changes. He thinks that the pressure from food corporations is sufficient, or promising anyway, as a way of inducing farmers around the world to adopt better practices.
Different crops can be genetically modified. And there's a word that scares a lot of people, but at any rate can be modified to develop more intense root systems, become more drought resistant, and store more carbon underground in extensive root systems. I thought that was an interesting concept. Certainly there are different processes that can be used in raising livestock to reduce methane emissions and fossil fuel consumption. One interesting article I saw recently had to do with feeding cattle a feed made from seaweed, which apparently reduces the amount of methane they emit. So there are much maligned Electoral College is voting now to confirm the election of President-elect Joe Biden. He has made a strong commitment to rejoin the Paris Treaty. John Kerry is an excellent, talented, well-respected person to lead the charge. And hopefully with the U.S. trying to get back into a position of setting an example and contributing to this global problem. The key thing that my co-author and I keep stressing is that we need to have more emphasis on public education. We have to get our young people who are going to be most affected by this involved. Without their strong support and action and incentives, it's going to be a difficult problem to solve.
Well, we don't have to motivate the young people. They're motivating us. By golly, they're ahead of us, really. Let's talk about trees a little bit, because I'm with you that we need, I believe that this outfit in Zurich a year or so ago said, we have 3 trillion trees on the planet and we need another 1 trillion more. Well, which means that we probably have to plant about 2 trillion more, because half of them are going to die. In fact, more than half probably.
Right. Yeah.
But now this is very much on my mind. I don't know where you're going to plant them, because it's a lot of work. 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. Now, when Canada says we'll plant some trees, they're talking about 1 billion or a couple of billion, maybe. And most other countries are talking about 1 or 2 billion. Listen, guys, 1,000 is a lot more than 1 or 2. And we really have
a lot more trees,
a lot more energy into this reforestation or afforestation. And I don't know how you're going to do it, because the only places where you can plant them are generally some distance away from farms and cities. Have you looked into tree planting in urban areas? There are empty parking lots, and I got lawn out there that I'd love to get rid of and replant with trees and so on. And we could do quite a bit by planting densely in cities, because that's where people exist and can look after them. The first couple of years, you got to water the trees and weed them and stuff. And
right.
If you just plant them out on top of a mountain someplace, nobody's going to do that. Give me some thoughts of how to do the reforestation and get it done.
I think there are new studies that indicate that urban trees do a lot more than people have given them credit for. So certainly that's not a bad idea to do that. And that's something that would meet with popular support. I mean, we had here in our local community on Balboa Island, a few trees that the city came in and removed because they had root systems that were disrupting the sewers. And there was a giant public outcry about it.
Really?
People didn't want to see those trees gone. But anyway, they were gone.
That's very interesting. That's one of the things that I would worry about, is they say it'll ruin the foundations of your house if you let those roots grow and stuff. Well, so I wonder if there's any solution to that, so that it wouldn't be too dangerous to plant trees instead of where the lawns go, because there's so much. It's very bad. The lawns are very bad. We could replace them with trees.
Yeah. Well, it's just a matter of finding the right kind of tree, I think. But, in our research, I think we determined that there were studies, people mapped the entire globe and looked for areas to plant trees. The total area they came up with, I think, was roughly equivalent to the United States in land area that would be available for planting trees, and that would certainly, in other words, the space is available to plant 1 trillion trees. So now it becomes a question of motivation and how do you get that process going. There's a lot of it's not just tropical areas also that are important. Some of the northern areas, like your country, have benefit in having more trees.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody sort of looks to the tropics, but that's not necessarily the total answer.
That's true, but I'm just really, I don't think there's a very clear answer. I've talked to a lot of foresters about it. What about planting trees in permafrost? Because Canada gets about a third of Canada gets permafrost. I think it really, to some extent, apparently depends on the kind of tree. The other thing we need to think about is wetlands, you know, peat and stuff. People go around, trying to dry up these wetlands so they can make them into agriculture, and we need them because that peat is a real place where the carbon is sequestered, and we want to keep it. Yeah. So you don't have any peat in California, do you, Bob?
No, I don't, not to my knowledge.
I just have to worry about your redwoods.
There's another grassland that is not typically recognized, and that's the seagrass in shallow waters all around the world. And that's another important means of capturing carbon.
Yeah, but it'd be nice if there was some use for it. And I think actually there is. I read a few years ago about being able to make fuels from seagrass or from, seaweed. I don't know what kind.
Some forms of kelp are harvested, but I think that's very minor.
Yeah.
Quantities.
I know. We'll take all of that seaweed and feed it to the cows so that they don't emit too much methane.
It may happen.
And one of my favorite world fixers is Paul Copeland, who's a retired lawyer, a human rights lawyer, who's a real expert on Burma, or as they call it nowadays, Myanmar. So give us a rundown on the history of this terrible situation.
The British had control of India and Pakistan in the British Raj, and eventually they expanded west and took over about half of what was Burma, and this is about 1820. And when they did that, they brought in people from what's now Bangladesh to live in the western part of Burma, do agriculture in what's now Rakhine State. Mm-hmm. And so they were there, and they remained there until Burma got its independence in 1947, since they were granted citizenship and lived in Burma and participated in the democratic form of government to some extent in 47 until the military took over in 1962. They continued to be citizens until 1982 when the military government took away their citizenship. And they continued to live there without citizenship and without any particular rights. In 1982, they took away their citizenship. They lived there until 2013. There were some attacks on the Rohingya. About 110,000 of them were placed in an internally displaced persons camp. And many of those people are still in that camp. They had very little medical care. Doctors Without Borders for a while did some service, and then they kicked Doctors Without Borders out of there. So that was where things went. And that had some funny effects on a group here called the Canadian Friends of Burma, which had been working in support of democracy. And it split the group because most of the Burmans in that group were not sympathetic to the Rohingya. So the group fell apart.
How painful this must be to you as a human rights lawyer, devoting yourself so much to protecting the rights of people who were abused. And now to find that the loyalties have shifted so much that most of the people that you wanted to help are now on the side of the government, which is doing abuses even worse, genocidal abuses.
Pretty much got me out of working for democracy in Burma. I mean, I'm still interested in it, but I'm not a fan of the government, and I'm not a fan of Aung San Suu Kyi anymore.
Yeah, well, that is exactly the kind of thing that must be excruciating. She's still revered by most of the people in Burma. Anyway, we're jumping ahead. We need to go back and just tell the story of what has happened.
We got to 2013 and the 110,000 people being in the IDP camp. Things just continued on in that fashion until 2017. And what the military claim is that there was an attack on a number of military outposts by the Rohingya. And that may well be accurate, that there was a bit of an attack, but it was pretty minor and pretty pathetically organized. And the army responded by slaughtering hundreds, maybe thousands of men, women, and children, raping women. That's what caused the Rohingya to flee the country. So about 1 million of them, maybe 700,000 fled at that point. And so it got the population in Cox's Bazar in that area of Bangladesh up to about 1 million people. And they're still in exile now. Some of them have just been relocated to an island. I can't remember the name of the island.
Not everybody's there because they want to be. This, is in itself a violation. And I know that we need to talk a little bit about the case that's been brought before the World Court. The trial that Gambia brought a charge against the government of Myanmar for genocide.
I think they're waiting to argue it. I don't know quite when they're going to ultimately argue it. They argued some of it. Aung San Suu Kyi came over to The Hague and argued some on behalf of her government. And Aung San Suu Kyi denied that there was genocide when she was at the Hague. And I'm sure they're going to argue that again when the thing comes up for final argument. And I rather expect that the court will find that it's genocide.
Mm-hmm.
But what comes out of that is another question.
They issued some sort of provisional demands or recommendations for the government to fulfill, and the government is making these reports every now and then, but so far there's no evidence that they're actually doing the things that they're supposed to be doing according to the court. There's
been certainly no movement on repatriation at all.
That's one of the things they're supposed to do. I would think I would be scared to go back. I think if I were a Rohingya, after what happened, having fled, of course, where else are they going to go?
Yes, I'd certainly be my position that the government has not demonstrated any willingness to be helpful and to restore them to where they were before. Well, where they were before 1982 when they had citizenship.
The people who kind of apologize for her or excuse her do so with the argument that she can't do anything else, that she's so much under the control of the army that in order to maintain any authority or any influence, that she has to go along with them and defend them.
I've been very disappointed in her activities. I mean, in the government side of things, when her party theoretically came to power, the military, the way they set up the Constitution, I think they hold 1/4 of the seats in Parliament, and they control a number of ministries, so that she doesn't have a whole lot of power to actually go against what they're talking about or what they want.
That. These two people are going to work to stop it. One is Gordon Edwards, who is the chair of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, and Susan O'Donnell, who is a sociologist, same as I am. She works at the University of New Brunswick. Maybe we'll let Gordon begin by telling us what we are up against.
Yes, well, the main problem with nuclear power is that while it is very concentrated, very powerful, it concentrates a lot of energy in a very small volume, and that's one of the main attractions. Also, because it doesn't involve combustion, it doesn't directly release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's a plus. Although there are a lot of greenhouse gases emitted in mining the uranium, refining the uranium, preparing the fuel, building the reactors, and looking after the waste for 100,000 years afterwards. So there's an awful lot of carbon dioxide emitted during all those procedures, even though not during the actual production of electricity. The problem with nuclear power, the number one problem, is that in splitting the uranium atoms, you get the broken pieces of uranium atoms that have been split. And these are extremely dangerous radioactive materials, intensely radioactive, and they remain dangerous for literally millions of years. And we don't know how to shut off radioactivity. And so this poses a long-term problem, an unsolved problem of the human race. And whether the reactor is large or small makes no difference in terms of the production of these wastes. These wastes are going to be produced and are going to be a burden for future generations, for many, many, many generations to come. The second thing is that among the radioactive materials that are created during fission is plutonium, a man-made material, a human-made material, which happens to be the primary nuclear explosive in the world's arsenal of nuclear weapons. And anyone who has access to plutonium can, in fact, make an atomic bomb, an atomic explosive. The amount of plutonium needed to destroy a city like Nagasaki is only the size of a small grapefruit. And so we have, for example, in the spent fuel, in the used fuel from every nuclear reactor, we have created repositories of plutonium. So wherever we plant nuclear reactors around the world, we are creating plutonium repositories. And because plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, it means that any regime, thousands of years in the future, or just next year, can take that plutonium, extract it from the used fuel, and use it to make atomic bombs. With the present generation of reactors that use uranium as a fuel, plutonium is automatically created as a byproduct. There's no way to prevent it. As the uranium atoms absorb a neutron and become a little heavier, and they change nature into a different type of element called plutonium, which happens to be also extremely toxic from a medical perspective. A few thousandths of a milligram inhaled into the lungs will kill a human being in a matter of months.
Are there other elements that could be used in nuclear bombs that get produced, or is it just plutonium that we need to worry about?
Plutonium is the main a nuclear explosive used today. There can be also highly enriched uranium. Highly enriched uranium was in fact used and uranium is naturally occurring, unlike plutonium.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike plutonium, uranium, you can mine it from the earth, but you can't use it as it comes out of the ground. You have to undergo a very complicated, sophisticated, expensive, energy-intensive process called enrichment, uranium enrichment, whereby you very carefully separate the heavier uranium atoms from the lighter ones. And it's those lighter uranium atoms that are explosive. And when you get enough of them together in one place, that's what happened with Hiroshima. We had a highly enriched uranium bomb. And a lot of that uranium, in fact, came from Canada. Some of it came directly from Canada, and some of it came indirectly from Canada through the Belgian Congo had uranium in the Second World War that was being mined for radium in those days. Radium was used in medical procedures by Marie Curie and her colleagues. But those uranium deposits were in fact processed in Canada at Port Hope, Ontario. So Canadian uranium and uranium from the Belgian Congo in combination fueled the first atomic bombs. And I must say the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that were built during the Cold War period as well.
Now I want to ask Susan a little bit, and it's a treat to find a co-sociologist who knows a thing or two about nuclear matters.
I did a research project, Metta, that ended several years ago that lasted for 13 years that involved the introduction of new technologies in remote and rural First Nations. So I spent a fair bit of time in remote First Nations and a fair bit of analysis on technology introduced into First Nations. And when I found out that the target market for these small nuclear reactors was remote and rural, remote First Nations and Inuit communities and mining sites, of course, that piqued my interest because the idea was so ludicrous, having spent time up there. The idea of these nuclear hulks dotted across the Canadian wilderness and in these small remote communities was just so ludicrous that I started to really become a lot more interested in it. And then I found out that, in fact, the Assembly of First Nations, I found out quite recently, has stated really clearly they don't want these things and they don't want the government to fund them. So there's so many questions. And when you look at the sociology of new technology and all the issues involved, I worked for a number of years, Metta, at the National Research Council in Fredericton. So I've worked with technologists and engineers, technology developers, and I've seen so many times the wonderful things you can do in a laboratory or the wonderful things you can do on a computer diagram and all these ideas about what wonderful possibilities they have. But then you put them out in the real world and you realize there's all kinds of other issues that come up, right? And
every one of us can attest to that. Yes. Every time our computer crashes, we have to consult experts.
Exactly.
The unintended experts themselves can't handle it. That's the terrible thing. We're getting too complicated for any human brain to process.
But the thing is, absolutely, but the thing is that none of these other issues that would immediately come to you as a sociologist and immediately come to Gordon because he's studied this for many decades, all of the other consequences of introducing these kinds of technologies are not discussed. And in fact, it's like a stealth operation going on. One of the things that's happened is that the industry has managed to convince governments to label these new technologies, and they're not that new, but these small reactors, clean technology, and that's the code they're using. So they're talking about funding clean technology, et cetera. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that, of course, given my interest, and also because there's two of them planned for New Brunswick, on the beautiful Bay of Fundy, which is a pristine, one of the richest marine ecosystems in the world. All of these things, and an environmentalist obviously concerned about these, raised my interest. And so I'm now involved in a national campaign with Gordon and with other colleagues to, as you say, try and stop funding for them because the federal government is proposing to fund them. And just one more comment, that I was delighted in your introduction when you said you've seen emails flying about these new reactors, because that means we're doing our job.
Although I'm in a network that has a lot of flying emails, I'm not sure everybody in the world is. So let's not get too confident that there's enough publicity. I think we need about 10 times as much publicity as we're getting now. Yeah.
Well, if the activists know about it, and you being an activist, Metta, that's the first step, and that's the important thing.
Everybody knows what a nuclear reactor is, more or less, but not everybody has ever heard of a small modular nuclear reactor.
It's a marketing ploy, really. They want people to buy reactors, and they have been dismally failing because the reactor population worldwide has not grown in the last 25 years. There have been really no net increase in number of nuclear power reactors in the world for the last 25 years. And the actual contribution of nuclear energy to global electricity production has declined during that same 25-year period from 17% down to 10% today.
Excellent.
So it's sharply decreasing. It's sharply decreasing. And the nuclear industry knows this, and they're quite desperate to try and keep their industry alive.
Yeah.
And so they're actually fighting for their life here. And what they're doing is, back in 2001, they launched what they called a nuclear renaissance, where they were going to build a whole lot of thousands of new large reactors around the world. And it turned out to be a fiasco. There were only a few reactors, large reactors built, one in Finland, four down in southern United States, and one in France, Flamanville. And they all turned out to be way, the cost escalation was enormous. And the companies even went bankrupt. The Areva company, which was involved in the Finland project, went bankrupt. And the Westinghouse company that was in the South Carolina reactor construction went bankrupt. So what they've now done is that they've said, look, we can't sell these large reactors. Nobody's buying them. So let's try small ones.
I hadn't heard about the large ones.
Yeah.
We're talking about some sort of supersize reactor.
No, they're about 1,000 megawatts, which is larger than most Canadian reactors, but that's fairly standard for American and French reactors. Germany is phasing out of nuclear power completely. They have already shut down 8 of their 17 reactors, and they're going to finish shutting them down by the middle of this decade. So
now they think that they can, they think they can make up the difference with renewable energy.
Yes, that's right. They have become leaders in wind power and solar energy. As a matter of fact, wind power and solar energy are going off the charts. They're increasing so rapidly. While nuclear power is on the decline, the renewables are increasing far more sharply than nuclear power ever did. And they have become cheaper than the nuclear option. And this is a great trouble to the salesman for small reactors. And of course, the cheapest thing of all is just simply energy efficiency, plugging the holes. As Amory Lovin said, if you can't keep hot water in your tub, maybe you don't need a larger hot water tank. Maybe all you need is a plug. And if we just plug the holes in our energy system, we would save an enormous amount of energy.
Yes.
A friend of mine who's Ralph Torrey, who's a very good analyst of renewable energy, he's pointed out that, for example, you know how we move from incandescent light bulbs to LED light bulbs? They use 80% less electricity, these LED, and you don't even notice the difference because you get the same benefit. Well, if we did the same thing with electric heating and turned to heat pumps instead of resistance heating, we would have a similar sharp reduction in energy demand. That in a province like Quebec, which is very large, of course, 1/5 of the Canadian population, if we converted our electrical heating systems to ground pumps, to ground heat pumps, we would have enough surplus electricity to run a whole electrified transportation sector without building any new electrical production facilities. The first principle of thermodynamics, the first law of thermodynamics, is that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So it's a misnomer to say that we consume energy. We don't consume energy, we simply convert it. And if we convert it efficiently, then we can manage with much less input. We don't need as much input if we just, for example, Ontario Hydro has, now it's Ontario Power Generation, their main building in Toronto has no furnace because it's totally, the whole building is a solar collector. It simply collects solar energy and heats the building that way. Well, anyway, with these small modular reactors, the problem is that they're not here. None of them have been built. None of them have been tested. They are speculative. They're based on technology that was developed in the 1960s and largely abandoned. And now they're trying to trot these new, as if they're new ideas. They're not new ideas. They're old ideas that had their day. And what's happening here is that we're actually kicking the can down the road again. Instead of dealing with climate change today, we're saying, oh, let's deal with it 10 or 20 years from now when we have a new fleet of nuclear reactors. They can't make any difference in the next decade, which is the crucial time period. We only have a small window of opportunity to really fight climate change. If we invest in renewables and energy efficiency, we can make a difference this year. We can make a difference in one building season. We can start, and the Germans demonstrated this with their wind power program. They installed 30,000 megawatts of wind power in only 8 years, 30,000 megawatts. Now that's twice the entire nuclear installations of Canada. Wow. And we have only 15,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity in Canada, actually less than that. So it's more than twice. And the interesting thing is that if you did this with nuclear, you would get no benefit until all the reactors are built, which is going to take you 10 years. In the meanwhile, you're adding to greenhouse gas emissions. You're making the problem worse. Whereas with wind power, you get immediate relief the very first year. You get wind power, and then you get more the next year, more the next year, more the next year, and you build up to 30,000 megawatts, making improvements every single year along the way. The sensible thing to do is to choose the cheapest, quickest, most available and proven technologies that are right available today. And those are off-the-shelf renewables and off-the-shelf energy efficiency measures, not speculative nuclear reactors that probably are not going to be affordable. They're going to be even more expensive than the old nukes, because they did build small reactors. And by the way, some of those small reactors melted down. They had catastrophic accidents. One of them was at Chalk River in 1952. It was a small reactor. It was only 10 megawatts of heat, much smaller than yeah, and it melted down. It had a series of explosions and a partial meltdown. So these things are not safe just because they're small. The main point is that every nuclear reactor is actually a reservoir, a warehouse, you might say, of radioactive poisons, which are created inside the reactor. And anything, whether it's an act of war, an act of terrorism, an industrial accident, or just overheating through a meltdown, anything that releases that material to the environment can be catastrophic, and the effects can last for generations. So it seems crazy that our government is buying the sales pitch without even considering that they don't have any customers. There are absolutely no customers who have actually signed on the dotted line saying, we promise to buy a small modular reactor once you get it working. None of them, they have an order book which is full of blank pages. It's a way where these nuclear entrepreneurs who have no other place to turn to are turning to governments, because the banks will not finance it. The Wall Street will not finance it.
Also, they can't get insurance for it, as I understand.
That's right. They can't even get offsite insurance for it. They have to have the government to cover their offsite insurance. So
one of the concerns in New Brunswick is that the bigger reactor of the two definitely plans to use reprocessing, and the second reactor is talking about using it as well. What they plan to do is
now, wait a minute. You can't. There are not many places in the world, as I understand it, reprocessing plants. But now these reactors, they don't reprocess their own stuff. They produce plutonium mixed in with other junk, right?
Well,
and you have to get the plutonium to use in a bomb or whatever you want to use it for, you have to separate it out chemically, right? And they don't do that right there in the reactor. They have to take it someplace.
There's a separate plant. So for example, one of the reactors called the Moltex reactor has two components in it, and they're not small. The reactor itself is about the size of a gymnasium, a school gymnasium. It's 30 by 30 meters. And then it also has a smaller unit that does the reprocessing to create the fuel. Right there, because the reason they are citing it on the Bay of Fundy is because that's where we have already a reactor, a CANDU reactor at Point Lepreau.
Okay,
And so
clear my head, because I'm worried about reprocessing, because I don't want them to get hold of plutonium so that they make bombs. All the other reasons are excellent reasons, but this is the where I came into the issue is the proliferation issue.
Absolutely.
My impression was that there are only, I don't know, 10 or 15 places in the world where reprocessing goes on, and that the name of the game is to stop them from building more, and indeed to outlaw reprocessing.
Now, this is actually, Metta, I'm glad that you're concerned and outraged to find out that we're planning to do this commercially in Canada, because this is a concern, a big concern that has not been talked about, certainly not in Parliament, not in our legislative assembly here. Yes, they are planning to do reprocessing on the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and there's been no discussion about it. And yes,
shame on us if we allow that.
Absolutely.
If I might say a word about this, the conventional reprocessing meta that you're thinking of, it was military, originally it was military in origin, they wanted to produce the plutonium for the bombs. They built tens of thousands of nuclear bombs, and they used large reprocessing plants, huge ones that are sort of like, they look like petroleum refineries. They're almost the size of petroleum refineries, and they extract, as you said, they extract the plutonium from the spent fuel. Now, when India exploded its first atomic bomb in 1974 using plutonium from a Canadian reactor that we gave them as a gift, but by the way, that was a small reactor. But they built their first atomic bomb using that plutonium, and they reprocessed it using that conventional method, which is dissolving it in acid. They dissolve the highly radioactive fuel in acid, and then they chemically separate, as you said quite rightly, they chemically separated out the plutonium from the rest of the junk and use that plutonium as a nuclear explosive. The plutonium itself is less than 1% of the fuel. So, you know, it's a small fraction. So they end up with a lot of radioactive waste, and they end up with a small amount of plutonium, which is powerful enough to make as many bombs as you want, really. Now, what happened after that explosion in 1974 was that South Korea, it was discovered, South Korea had bought Canadian reactors, and they were planning a nuclear weapons program of their own. And they were planning to start reprocessing plutonium and separating plutonium. And when the Americans, who are more or less sponsors of the South Koreans, when they found out about it, they said, no way are we going to allow you to reprocess and separate plutonium, because it's too dangerous, and we're not going to allow it. We're going to cut all our ties with you. We won't give you any more aid, either financial or military. So South Korea cooled it and didn't do that. And instead, they developed a new method called pyroprocessing. And pyroprocessing is what they want to use in New Brunswick. And pyroprocessing is a way where instead of dissolving it in acid, you dissolve it in something called molten salt. And you do it on a smaller scale. You don't have to have such a huge plant. You do it on a smaller scale. You make a molten salt solution of the radioactive waste from the CANDU reactor next door. And then you use an electrical method for separating out not only the plutonium, but a few other things with it. So they're called the minor actinides. And they argue, and the South Koreans have been arguing, that because we're not separating plutonium completely from everything else, but only plutonium accompanied by other things, therefore we should be allowed to do this. Well, South Korea has still not got permission to do this because it takes a large step towards making atomic bombs. If you can separate out the most radioactive stuff from the spent fuel and get a plutonium solution which is far less radioactive, then you're a long way towards the final product of getting the plutonium separated totally and making bombs with it. So this is why South Korea has not been allowed to proceed with this. Well, that's the same technology they want to use in New Brunswick. So you could say that Canadians are being used as dupes.
Is any place using it already? This
No,
whatever.
there's no place, as far as to the best of my knowledge, there's no place using it. And in fact, even the people who are experts in reprocessing in the United States, for example, Ed Lyman and Frank von Hippel and so on, have very little knowledge about the details of pyroprocessing because we don't have experience with it.
Who invented it, and yeah, who's got control of this thing?
It was originally developed by the Argonne Laboratory in the United States. The concept was developed by Argonne Laboratory, and I believe they might have done some experimental trial runs. And South Korea has seen this as they want to move forward. They want to move forward. Everybody in the whole nuclear industry worldwide would love to be able to get at that plutonium, because that is the fuel of the future from their point of view. They think that in the future, if we could only use this plutonium, then we could extend the lifetime of nuclear power for many centuries beyond what is now possible. And that's why they want to get at this plutonium. But the difficulty is, and this has been an existential debate for decades, the trouble is that as soon as you separate plutonium for use commercially, you make it available essentially to criminals and terrorists, because anything that is traded commercially, some of it is going to fall into the hands of criminals.
You reviewed a book by Frank von Hippel that the main point of the book, I think, was to say we should ban reprocessing completely and abolish not only preventing any future use of it, but destroying the plants that now use it. Because
yes, and that's why President Carter, he did ban reprocessing in the United States back in the 1970s. He was a nuclear engineer in the nuclear navy, and he knew what all of this stuff really meant. Mm-hmm. And so he banned plutonium reprocessing. They were building a large reprocessing plant in the United States of America at that time. And he not only banned it in the US, but he also tried to get it banned worldwide.
But you said he banned it. So he meant no future reprocessing plants. Is that?
That's correct. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. When I say banned it, what he was banning was the commercialization of reprocessing.
Okay.
The idea of making this a commercial thing, which is exactly what New Brunswick is trying to do here with the small modular reactors.
I'd like for you to give me some idea of what kind of movement you're trying to coordinate there in the Maritimes.
And we formed a group called the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, CRED-NB, and we've been very active. We see what we're trying to do is to stop or slow down the federal funding for these reactors. And so far, it looks like there's some public funds coming, and that's what we want to do, is to try and slow it down. So we've done we've focused on two things. First of all, definitely letters to politicians and all of that, but we need to raise public awareness. So we've been doing Facebook campaigns, we've been doing media releases. We've had some success just recently in getting out into the CBC, for example. We have to educate journalists. They tend to see it as a complex issue, and so they just shy away from it or cover it very superficially. So we're educating journalists, trying to get the word out so that there'll be public pressure on the politicians. Then we're doing the politicians directly. And as I mentioned earlier, we're working on a national level. So CRED-NB is working with groups across the country, including Gordon's group. Right now, there's a big sign-on that's being coordinated by the Canadian Environmental Law Association, CELA. We have almost 80 groups from across the country signed on, and we've just started to collect group sign-ons. And what we're trying to do is show the strength of the resistance to these across the country. So that's a whole educating piece. Mm-hmm. So we are working very hard. Unfortunately, we're expecting the announcement for the New Brunswick reactors. They've asked for $70 million to start, which would only be a drop in the bucket for what they need. And we've been constantly told that the announcement's coming before the end of the year. So we're preparing for that one. And yes, then the other thing that we're doing is looking at educating the local community, because we do have a reactor there right now, the Point Lepreau reactor. And so there's a certain level of complacency, I would say.
You can go to the CCNR website, which is www.ccnr.org, or they can go to the CRED-NB website, which Susan can give, and they can sign up basically and say, send me more information on small modular reactors and on the problems. One of the difficulties that we have here is that people feel mystified. They don't feel that they know enough. They don't feel that they have enough understanding of what's involved. And so our groups are trying to express it in simple language that anybody can ultimately understand.
For the CRED site, it's crednb, one word, .ca. Thank you.
I'll put this on the title page at the end. Whenever you're planning something that maybe I can help with Peace Magazine or with our website and by the way, please post things on our website, because we have a comments column, and you can post things and then reply to what other people have posted. So I'm trying to encourage people to go there and share ideas and information on the website about this and all the other issues that we're dealing with. We've got 6 global threats to handle, and you folks are handling one of them beautifully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Metta.
Thank you, Metta.
Good. You take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.